Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. Back in 1991, a 13-year-old girl named Carmine was abducted from her home in Melbourne. Even now, decades later, the details of what happened feel almost unbearable to think about. She wasn't alone in the house. Her two younger sisters were there with her. That alone makes the story harder to sit with, because it means there were witnesses, children who were forced to experience something no child ever should. That night, a man broke into their home. He forced Carmine's sisters into a closet and shut them inside. Then he took Carmine. She was taken from her own house, from a place that should have been safe. Her parents weren't far away at all. They were only about 10 minutes away, working at their family restaurant. They had no idea that in such a short window of time, their lives were about to be permanently destroyed. The sisters survived physically, but the trauma of being locked away while their sister was taken is something that doesn't fade. The fear, the confusion, the guilt that children often carry even when they've done nothing wrong. They were powerless in that moment, and that powerlessness echoes through the rest of the story. Not long after the abduction, something happened that has haunted my family ever since. My aunt was out riding her bike with a friend near a shed in Kinnerton. It was an ordinary day. Nothing about it felt unusual at first. They were just kids riding around, doing what kids do, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Then they passed a shed, and inside they saw something that stopped them cold. Inside the shed was a girl tied to a chair. Standing behind her was a man wearing a black balaclava. The image was shocking, confusing, and terrifying. It didn't look like a movie scene. It looked real. The girl was bound. The man was masked. There was no context that made it feel safe or explainable. My aunt didn't see the girl's entire face clearly, but something about her stayed fixed in her mind. The fear in her posture, the way she was restrained, the feeling that what they were seeing was very, very wrong. They didn't stop. They didn't confront the man. Instinct took over. They rode their bikes as fast as they could back to my grandparents' house. My mom was there, along with her younger sister and brother, all inside with my grandparents. Everyone was home, safe, normal. And my aunt burst in, shaken, trying to explain what she had just seen. She told my grandma about the girl in the shed, about the man in the black balaclava. There was no hesitation. My grandma immediately understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding or prank. This was serious. She called the police right away. It's important to remember that this was the early 1990s. There were no mobile phones, no instant GPS, no way to quickly share photos or videos. The only way to contact police was through a landline or by going in person. So after calling, my grandparents got into the car and drove to the shed themselves, hoping to help, hoping maybe the girl was still there. By the time they arrived, the shed was empty. Whoever had been there was gone, which, in hindsight, makes sense. Someone who has kidnapped a child and realizes they've been seen would flee immediately. They wouldn't stay and wait. The police did investigate. They went to the location. They looked around. But this was before advanced DNA testing, before the forensic tools that exist today. There were no clear leads, No physical evidence strong enough to build a case. The sighting went nowhere, not because it wasn't important, but because the system at the time simply didn't have the tools to act on it properly. Life moved on in the cruel way it always does after tragedy. The case stayed open, but answers never came. Then, on April 9th, 1992, the worst possible confirmation arrived. Carmine's remains were found at a landfill dump. Her skull had 3 bullet holes. Experts estimated that her body had been there for at least 12 months. That meant she had likely been killed not long after her abduction. Whatever hope people had clung to, however faint, was gone. She was 13 years old. Hearing that kind of detail changes how a story feels forever. It's no longer an unsolved disappearance. It's a murder, a violent one. And the fact that she was discarded in a landfill, treated like waste, adds another layer of cruelty that's hard to comprehend. For my aunt, the weight of what she had seen never went away. Years passed, decades even. On the surface, life continued. People grew up, families changed. But inside her, that moment by the shed stayed alive. The image of the girl tied to the chair, the man standing behind her. The question that never fully went away. What if? What if they had done something different? What if they had stayed longer? What if they had gone straight to the shed instead of riding back first? What if help had arrived sooner? Logically, none of that is fair. She was a child. She did exactly what a child should do. She told an adult. The adults called the police. They followed the right steps. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. It eats quietly over time. A few years ago, my aunt finally went back to the police and reported the sighting again. Not because she thought it would magically solve the case, but because the guilt had become too heavy to carry alone. She needed to know she had done everything she possibly could. At first, nothing seemed to come of it. Then, just a few days ago, the police called her back. They told her they still had no solid leads, but they asked her to recount the sighting again, in full detail. Everything she could remember. The shed, the girl, the man, the balaclava, the positioning, the feeling, even the things she wasn't sure about. My aunt admitted she never saw the girl's full face clearly. Time has blurred some details. Memory is imperfect, especially when trauma is involved. But she is certain of one thing. She is certain the girl she saw was Carmine. That certainty has never left her. Recently, it has also come to light that Mr. Cruel, a notorious and feared serial rapist who terrorized Melbourne during that era, is now considered the prime suspect in Carmine's murder. He was known for breaking into homes, abducting young girls, and using extreme control and planning. The details of his crimes overlap chillingly with what happened to Carmine. For many people, that connection feels like it finally makes sense of pieces that never fit before. But even that doesn't bring peace. A suspect isn't the same as justice, and decades of waiting leave wounds that don't close easily. What makes this story especially devastating is how close it came to a different outcome. Someone saw her, someone noticed, someone tried to help, and still, it wasn't enough. That reality is hard to accept. It forces you to confront how fragile timing really is, how the difference between rescue and loss can be measured in minutes, in chance encounters, in whether someone chooses one direction over another. Carmine wasn't just a name in a file. She was a sister, a daughter, a child who should have grown up. Her parents were 10 minutes away, working to support their family, unaware that they would never see her alive again. Her sisters were locked in a closet, carrying memories no child should ever have to live with. And my aunt has carried her own burden ever since. The knowledge that she may have been one of the last people to see Carmine alive. The uncertainty of whether something more could have been done. The ache of knowing that even doing the right thing doesn't always lead to the right outcome. Stories like this don't fade. They don't belong neatly to the past. They resurface in phone calls, in renewed investigations, in quiet moments when guilt and grief resurface without warning. She was 13 years old. That fact alone should stop anyone in their tracks. No amount of time makes that easier to accept. No new development erases what was taken from her or from the people who loved her. But remembering her, telling her story, and continuing to seek the truth still matters. Because she wasn't just a victim of a crime. She was a child whose life was stolen. And the people who crossed paths with her, even briefly, still carry her with them. I dated a girl a while back, and through her, I learned about something that still doesn't sit right with me no matter how much time has passed. It's one of those stories that sounds unreal when you first hear it, like something pulled from a headline or a documentary, except it wasn't distant or abstract. It was personal. It involved real people I knew, people I spent time with, people who sat across from me and talked about their lives like everything was normal. The girl I dated, I'll call her Ajay, had a complicated family history. Her parents divorced when she was young, and like a lot of divorces, it split the family in ways that never really healed. AJ ended up moving to Dallas with her dad while her sisters stayed behind in southern Texas with their mom. At first, it seemed like a fairly standard custody situation. Not ideal, but not unusual. Kids often get divided between parents after a separation, especially when distance is involved. AJ talked about her sister often. There was love there, but also confusion. She didn't fully understand why things felt so strained whenever she tried to connect with her. When Aj visited her mom once or twice a year, she noticed that her sister was kept at a distance. Her mom wouldn't really let them play together. There were always excuses. Her sister was busy. Her sister didn't feel like it. Her sister needed to stay inside. At the time, Aj didn't immediately jump to the worst conclusion. Kids grow up trusting their parents, even when things don't feel right. She knew something was off, but she didn't know how off. Eventually, her mom stopped letting Aj visit altogether. She told Aj's dad that her sister didn't want to see him anymore. She blamed him for leaving, for breaking up the family, for everything that had gone wrong. Over time, communication between Aj's dad and her mom faded until it almost didn't exist. Calls went unanswered. Messages stopped being returned. It was like her mom and sister had vanished into a different world. What Aj didn't know at the time, and what she only learned much later, was what was actually happening inside that house. Her mom and stepdad had started locking her sister in a closet. Not occasionally. Not as punishment for misbehavior. This was ongoing, systematic, for years. That closet became where her sister lived. She ate in that closet. She slept in that closet. She used the bathroom in that closet, peeing and defecating where she was confined because she had no other choice. It was dark. It was cramped. It was isolating in a way that's hard to fully imagine unless you've experienced something similar. That space wasn't meant for a human being, let alone a child. The most disturbing part is that on the surface, life continued as if everything was normal. Her sister was allowed out of the closet to go to school. She put on clean clothes. She showed up. She functioned. Teachers saw a quiet, well-behaved student. Classmates saw a girl who blended in. No one suspected that when the school day ended, she would go back home and be locked away again. Meanwhile, Aggie's mom went on to have more children with her boyfriend. Babies were born. A new family grew, all while one child was being hidden and erased in the same house. She existed, but she wasn't allowed to live. At some point, people started to notice something wasn't right. AJ's mom became harder and harder to reach. Calls stopped being returned. Messages went unanswered. Even people who lived in the same house struggled to get help. Eventually, one of Adge's half-brothers, who was living with their mom, told someone at school what was happening. He spoke up about his half-sister being kept in a closet. That moment changed everything. It was the crack in the wall that finally let light in. Authorities got involved. They tried to contact Adge's dad, but couldn't reach him right away. With no parent immediately available, they placed Adge's sister into foster care temporarily until her father could be located. That transition alone must have been terrifying. Being removed from the only environment you've known, even if it was abusive, can be deeply disorienting. Abuse becomes a twisted version of normal when it's all you've ever experienced. There is a lot more to the story. Layers of manipulation, fear, and control that stretched far beyond what most people realize. I'm trying not to introduce more names or details because it gets complicated quickly, and because there were real threats involved. Her sister was threatened repeatedly. She was told that if she ever told the full story, if she ever explained everything that happened in that house, her life would be in danger. That threat wasn't abstract. It wasn't symbolic. It was made very real to her. And the cruel irony is that her life was already being threatened daily, just by being locked in that dark closet and forced to survive under conditions no child should ever endure. When Adge finally told me about all of this, it was clear how deeply it had affected her. There was guilt, confusion, anger. She had been removed from that environment as a child, and while that saved her from experiencing the same abuse, it also left her with the knowledge that her sister suffered without her being able to help. Eventually, Adge wanted to introduce me to her dad and the rest of her family. It mattered a lot to her. Her dad was extremely protective of his daughters, and she didn't take bringing someone into that space lightly. Before doing that, she wanted me to understand her family history, especially her sister's. When I finally met her sister, I wasn't prepared for how normal everything seemed. She didn't act withdrawn or unstable. She didn't behave the way people expect someone with that level of trauma to behave. She was intelligent, polite, and incredibly well-spoken. Talking to her felt easy, natural. She had a warmth to her that made people feel comfortable around her. She was also in what appeared to be a healthy relationship with a boy. There was mutual respect there. Kindness. The kind of connection that suggests emotional awareness and resilience. She laughed easily. She engaged thoughtfully in conversation. There was nothing about her presence that screamed victim, and she was extremely beautiful, strikingly so. If you didn't know her story, you would never guess what she had been through. You wouldn't look at her and imagine years spent in darkness, isolation, and fear. You wouldn't picture a child being locked away while the rest of the household carried on. That contrast is one of the hardest parts to reconcile. People often assume trauma always shows itself outwardly, that survivors look broken, fragile, or visibly damaged. But that's not how it always works. Some people carry unimaginable pain quietly. They learn how to function, how to adapt, how to present themselves in ways that protect them from further harm. Meeting her forced me to confront how wrong my assumptions were about what trauma looks like. It also made me furious. I couldn't understand how anyone could treat a child that way. How a parent could make a decision like that and then repeat it day after day. how other children could grow up in the same house while one was hidden away like something shameful or disposable. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't neglect. It was torture. And the fact that it went on for years without intervention is a failure on so many levels. A failure of adults, a failure of systems, a failure of people who saw pieces of the situation but didn't see the whole picture until it was almost too late. Even knowing that there are news stories about this case, Age always said they didn't fully capture the reality of what happened. Media simplifies things, it shortens timelines, it misses the daily reality, the fear, the isolation, the constant threat. Those things don't fit neatly into articles or reports. What stayed with me most was how calm her sister was when she spoke. Not detached, not numb, just composed. Like someone who had learned very early how to survive by staying quiet, observant, and careful. That kind of composure doesn't come from nowhere. It's forged. I still think about her sometimes. About the strength it must have taken to endure that kind of childhood and still emerge as someone capable of connection, intelligence, and kindness. I think about how many children don't survive experiences like that emotionally, even if they survive physically. And I think about how easily abuse can hide behind closed doors. This wasn't some hidden basement or remote cabin. This was a house with kids going to school, with neighbors, with normal routines on the surface. And yet something horrific was happening every day in a dark, enclosed space that most people never questioned. It changed how I see people, how I see families, how I see silence. You never really know what someone has survived just by looking at them. You never know what kind of strength it takes just to sit across from someone and talk about the weather, or relationships or life plans when your past includes things that would break many people completely. I don't use the word insane lightly, but I don't know another word that fits. The cruelty, the indifference, the willingness to dehumanize a child so completely. It's beyond comprehension. And yet, the person who endured it wasn't defined by it in the way people expect. She wasn't reduced to her trauma. She wasn't consumed by it. She carried it, yes, but she didn't let it erase her. That's what stays with me. Not just the horror of what was done to her, but the quiet resilience of who she became in spite of it. My granddad lived with something his entire life that most people can't even imagine carrying. It wasn't something he talked about easily, and it wasn't something that ever really left him, no matter how many years passed. When he was young, still just a teenager himself, he accidentally killed his younger brother. There was no anger involved, no argument, no bad intentions. Just one moment of terrible timing that changed everything forever. This happened when my granddad was about 17 years old. Back then, life was different, especially where they lived. Work started early, responsibilities came young, and teenagers were often expected to do hard, adult labor without much thought, given to how dangerous it could be. Their family lived on a piece of land that my granddad still lives on to this day. It's land that carries history, memory, and in this case, deep loss. They were doing logging on the property. Cutting trees wasn't unusual work for them. It was part of life, part of survival, part of maintaining the land. It wasn't treated like something extraordinary or especially dangerous. It was just something that needed to be done, and my granddad was old enough to be trusted with it. His younger brother, my great-uncle, was only 15 at the time. That detail alone makes the story heavier. 15 is still a kid in so many ways, old enough to follow around, to want to help, to be curious, but still young enough to trust that older siblings know what they're doing. There's no indication that my great uncle was doing anything wrong. He wasn't being reckless. He was just there, somewhere nearby, on land he knew as well as anyone else. The land itself matters to the story. There was a holler below where my great uncle was standing, a low area hidden from view where sound carries strangely and sight lines aren't always clear. My granddad couldn't see him from where he was working. He didn't know his brother was there. He didn't know anyone was in danger. When my granddad cut the tree, he did what he had probably done many times before. He judged the fall as best as he could. He worked the way he had been taught, and then the tree came down. It fell straight into the holler below. The tree crushed my great uncle. There's no way to soften that reality. A moment that likely lasted only seconds ended a life and destroyed another in a completely different way. My granddad didn't realize what had happened right away. When he did, the shock must have been overwhelming. Panic. Horror. The kind of fear that freezes your blood because you know something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. They rushed my great uncle to the hospital. In moments like that, people cling to hope, even when the injuries are severe. You tell yourself that doctors will fix it, that miracles happen, that it can't really be as bad as it looks. Families sit in waiting rooms praying for outcomes they know, deep down, may not come. My great uncle died in the hospital a short while later from his injuries. He was 15 years old. For my granddad, that wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was the knowledge that he was the one who caused it, even though it was an accident, even though there was no intent, even though any number of small changes could have prevented it. That kind of guilt doesn't fade with time. It settles in and becomes part of who you are. People often say things like, "It wasn't your fault," in situations like this. And while that may be true in a logical sense, it doesn't undo the weight of responsibility someone feels. My granddad knew the tree fell because he cut it. That fact alone was enough to shape the rest of his life. He carried that with him into adulthood, into marriage, into fatherhood, into old age. The land where it happened didn't disappear. It wasn't sold. It wasn't abandoned. My granddad still lives on that property to this day. That means he wakes up every morning surrounded by reminders, the trees, the hills, the holler, the same ground where his brother died. Some people might not understand how someone could stay in a place like that, but for others, leaving doesn't bring peace either. Sometimes staying is the only way to make sense of what happened. Sometimes leaving feels like another kind of betrayal. Living there meant he never forgot, but it also meant he stayed connected to his brother in a quiet, constant way. The land became both a burden and a memorial, even if it was never officially treated as one. Growing up, I knew this story, but I didn't fully understand it until I was older. As a kid, you hear something like that, and it feels distant, almost unreal. Accidents feel abstract. Death feels like something that happens in stories or on the news. It's only later, when you understand how quickly life can change, that the weight of it truly sinks in. As I got older, I started to think about what it must have been like for my granddad in those moments after the accident. The realization, the rush to the hospital, the waiting, the hope turning into grief. And then the long years afterward, where everyone else continues living, but you're always carrying that one moment with you. I also think about my great uncle, about who he might have become if he had lived, what kind of man he would have been, what kind of life he would have built. 15 is an age full of potential, even if you don't realize it at the time. That potential was taken away in an instant. The tragedy didn't just affect my granddad. It affected the entire family. Parents lost a child, siblings lost a brother, and everyone had to navigate grief layered with guilt, silence, and the understanding that no one meant for this to happen. Accidental deaths often create complicated grief. There's no one to blame in a way that brings closure. There's no villain, just a chain of events that went wrong. That can make healing even harder, because anger doesn't have a clear place to go. My granddad rarely spoke about it openly. When he did, it was quiet, measured, without dramatics. He didn't try to justify it or downplay it. He didn't make excuses. He acknowledged it as something that happened and something he lived with. That kind of acceptance doesn't mean peace. It means endurance. Even now, knowing that he still lives on that land, I can't help but think about how every sound of a tree falling must carry an echo for him. How every memory of hard work in the woods is probably tied to that one day. How certain places on the property likely hold more weight than others. It's a reminder of how fragile life can be, especially in environments where danger is treated as routine. It's also a reminder of how young people are often placed in situations that carry far more risk than they fully understand. There was no crime here, no malice, no wrongdoing in the legal sense. But the impact was just as real as any intentional act of violence. A life was lost. Another was permanently altered. Stories like this don't make headlines. They don't get documentaries or long investigations. They live quietly inside families, passed down in hushed tones, carried by the people who were there and the people who loved them. It also changes how future generations think about safety, responsibility, and work. When you grow up knowing a story like this, it becomes part of how you see the world. You become more aware of how quickly things can go wrong, how one decision, one unseen detail, can have lifelong consequences. I sometimes think about how different everything would have been if my granddad had seen his brother in the holler, if someone had called out, if the timing had been slightly different. Those questions don't have answers, and asking them doesn't change anything, but they're hard not to think about. What remains is the reality that my granddad lived on, carrying both grief and guilt, building a life while holding on to that loss. That kind of strength isn't loud. It doesn't look heroic. It looks like getting up every day and continuing on, even when part of you's forever stuck in the past. His younger brother didn't get that chance, and that loss, even generations later, still matters. It still shapes how the story is told. It still shapes how the land feels. And it still shapes the family in ways that are quiet but real. It's one of those tragedies that doesn't fade with time. It simply settles into the background of life, always there, always remembered, even when it's not spoken out loud. And maybe that's the hardest part, knowing that one moment, one accident, can ripple outward for decades, touching people who weren't even born yet. That's the weight my granddad has carried his whole life, and it's a weight that never truly goes away. My dad works in law, and growing up I heard a lot of stories that most kids never do. They weren't the dramatic courtroom scenes you see on TV, but quieter, stranger stories about the kinds of people the justice system comes into contact with. Some of those stories faded over time, but a few stayed with me, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they were deeply unsettling in a way that never really leaves you. One story in particular goes back more than 20 years. This was long before true crime podcasts were everywhere and before people casually talked about cases over coffee. Back then, it felt heavier somehow, more personal. My dad was overseeing the extradition of a man who was being sent back to Michigan. The purpose wasn't to decide guilt yet, but to determine whether this man was mentally competent enough to stand trial. That alone tells you something was wrong, but even knowing that, nothing prepared him for the person who walked in. The man was small, maybe around 5'2", thin to the point of looking fragile. He was pale, with red hair and these slightly awkward, old-fashioned glasses that made him look more like a shy college student than someone in serious legal trouble. If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't cross the road to avoid him. You probably wouldn't notice him at all. He looked innocent, almost harmless, like the kind of person you'd trust to watch your dog or help carry groceries. My dad said his first thought was genuine confusion. He couldn't understand what someone who looked like that could possibly have done to end up in this situation. Then he read the case file. It turned out that this man had killed his boyfriend in a way so violent and shocking that it completely rewired my dad's understanding of how deceptive appearances can be. During sex, he had ripped out his boyfriend's throat using his teeth, not a weapon. Not a moment of distant violence, something intimate, close, and horrifying. Even years later, writing it out still feels unreal. The contrast between how the man looked and what he had done was almost impossible to reconcile. It wasn't just the act itself, but the setting. Something that should have been private and consensual turned into an act of extreme brutality. My dad said it was one of those moments where your brain struggles to connect two realities. The man sitting in front of him looked nervous, almost polite. But the crime described in the documents was savage in a way that felt almost animal. As if that wasn't disturbing enough, the interaction itself took an even stranger turn. At some point during the process, the man casually offered my dad his watch. There was no clear reason for it, no context, no explanation. He just held it out as if offering a small gift, like someone trying to be friendly or grateful. That detail stuck with my dad more than almost anything else. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. It was just deeply wrong. The kind of gesture that makes your skin crawl because it doesn't fit the situation at all. My dad never figured out why he did it. Maybe it was manipulation. Maybe confusion. Maybe something darker. Whatever the reason, it made the whole encounter feel surreal and eerie, but like being trapped in a nightmare that didn't follow normal rules. That story alone would be enough to unsettle anyone. But it wasn't the only time my dad came face to face with true evil. Years later, he also worked on a case involving a serial killer named Scott Wilson Williams. Williams is currently on death row in North Carolina for the murders of 3 women in the late 1990s and early 2000s. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of sudden violence. They were deliberate, repeated acts carried out over time. My dad defended him, which is something people often struggle to understand when they hear it. Defending someone like that doesn't mean excusing what they did. It means making sure the legal process is followed correctly, that the system does what it claims to do, even when the person on trial is someone society would rather forget exists. Still, that doesn't make it easy. Williams, unlike the first man, didn't look especially harmless. There was something colder there, something heavier. My dad said being around him felt different. Less confusing, but more oppressive. There was no shock of contrast. Just the slow realization that some people move through the world without the emotional boundaries most of us take for granted. What stayed with my dad wasn't just the violence of the crimes, but the emotional emptiness. The way Williams spoke about what he had done. The lack of visible remorse. It wasn't theatrical or dramatic. It was flat, almost casual, which somehow made it worse. Growing up with these stories didn't make me fascinated with true crime. If anything, it made me wary of it. These weren't puzzles to solve or mysteries to enjoy. They were real people, real victims, and real moments of suffering that didn't end neatly when the case closed. What all of these stories taught me is how unreliable appearances can be. The most terrifying people aren't always the ones who look frightening. Sometimes they look like Boy Scouts. Sometimes they look like quiet men with glasses. Sometimes they offer you their watch with a polite smile. It also taught me something about the justice system that most people don't think about. The people who work in it aren't shielded from the darkness. They carry these stories with them, often silently, back into their homes and their lives. They learn to live with the knowledge that humanity is capable of things that don't make sense, no matter how much you try to understand them. Even now, when I think about that small red-haired man or the serial killer my dad defended, what unsettles me most isn't just what they did. It's how normal the moments around the crime seemed. How easily evil blended into everyday life. How close it came to ordinary conversations, office hallways, and paperwork. These weren't monsters in the way movies portray them. They were people. And that's what makes it so hard to sit with. Because once you accept that, you realize how fragile the line between normalcy and horror really is. Those stories stay with me, not as entertainment, but as quiet reminders. Reminders that the world is more complicated and darker than it appears on the surface. Reminders that the justice system exists not just to punish, but to confront truths most of us would rather never face. And reminders that sometimes the creepiest moments aren't the violent ones, but the calm, polite, almost friendly gestures that make you realize just how wrong something truly is. When I think back on my childhood, there are moments that feel distant and blurry, like they belong to someone else. And then there are moments that are painfully sharp, as if they never stopped happening. This is one of those moments. It's something that still shows up in my dreams, something my body remembers even when my mind wants to forget. What makes it worse is knowing that it didn't happen by accident. It happened because adults made choices that put children directly in danger. My childhood friend's mom had a pattern. I didn't have the words for it back then, but I understand it now. She kept predators around her kids, not by accident, not unknowingly. She surrounded herself with people who were dangerous because those people were easy for her to control. They stayed close because being around her gave them access to children. Her children. Other children. Kids who trusted her home because it was supposed to be safe. One of those people was a man named Brent. Brent was 34 years old. He was married to a woman named Bree. Both of them were known to be unsafe around children. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. They were not supposed to be left alone with kids. There were rules in place for a reason, and those rules were ignored. I don't feel any hesitation using their real names. What happened was terrifying, and it has stayed with me for years. I still have night terrors about that day. Names don't feel like the problem here. Silence is. That day was supposed to be simple, innocent. We were just kids hanging out, doing what kids do. All I wanted was to watch the Hun League finale with my friends. That's it. That was the plan. That was the excitement. A group of kids, snacks, TV, nothing dangerous or strange about it. Then Bree suggested we play hide and seek. On the surface, that sounds harmless. Hide and seek is a normal game. Kids play it all the time. But something about the way she suggested it felt wrong immediately. It wasn't playful. It wasn't lighthearted. There was something in her tone, something in the way she looked at Brent, that made my stomach drop. She suggested that Brent would be the seeker. Every instinct in my body reacted at once. I didn't have the language to explain it, but I knew something was very wrong. That feeling didn't come from nowhere. It was loud. It was urgent. It felt like an alarm going off inside my chest. When Brent started counting to 10, everything changed. The girls didn't giggle. They didn't whisper or laugh like kids usually do during games. They bolted. They ran like their lives depended on it. There was no playfulness at all, just panic and silence. They hid in places that weren't easy to reach, places that required effort, climbing, squeezing into tight spaces, the kind of places you don't choose unless you are trying to disappear. That alone should have told any adult that something was wrong. I wasn't as lucky. When Brent reached 10, he didn't walk around casually, calling our names like someone playing a game. He hunted us. That's the only word that fits. His voice changed. It wasn't joking. It wasn't fun. It was slow and deliberate, like he was enjoying the fear. "I'm gonna find you," he said. "I'm gonna eat you up." Those words still make my skin crawl. I ran from room to room, a heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was just trying to survive. I looked for a door, a window, anything at ground level that could get me out of that house. Every instinct I had was screaming that this man was dangerous, that if he caught me, something terrible would happen. I didn't feel like a kid playing a game. I felt like prey. Then he saw me. I will never forget the look on his face. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't excitement. It was something twisted and euphoric, like he had been waiting for this moment. His smile was wrong in a way that's hard to describe unless you've seen it. It wasn't just happiness. It was possession. He reached out toward me and said, "There's a naughty girl who wasn't playing by the rules. That's okay. I like naughty girls." That sentence is burned into my memory. I was near the back door. I didn't hesitate. I ran. He was fast, but I was faster. Fear gives you speed you don't know you have. I knew the neighborhood better than he did. I didn't think about where I was going, just away from him. The town judge lived next door. He was outside in his garden with his pit bull. I ran straight to him, crying so hard I could barely breathe. I pointed back toward Brent and told him that man was chasing me. That was enough. After that day, we never saw Brent or Bree again. Later, we learned why. The judge told us that Brent had broken the terms of his parole. He was not supposed to be within 100 feet of a child. Not 100 feet. And yet there he was, inside a house full of children, playing a game designed to isolate and terrorize them. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice. And the more I've thought about it as an adult, the more horrifying it becomes. Not just because of Brent, but because of the adults who enabled him. Because my friend's mother deliberately left children alone with people like that. Because she created an environment where predators felt comfortable. Because she benefited from it in some way, whether that was control, money, substances, or something else entirely. The thought that our safety may have been traded for cigarettes or favors is something that still makes me feel sick. What stays with me isn't just the fear, it's the betrayal. Kids trust adults to protect them. We trust homes to be safe. We trust that when someone is known to be dangerous, they won't be allowed near us. That trust was broken deliberately. I still think about the other girls. about how fast they ran, about how they knew exactly where to hide. That tells me they had learned something already. They knew what kind of danger Brent was. They had already been living with fear long before that day. I think about how close it came to being worse. If I hadn't been near the back door, if I hadn't known the neighborhood, if the judge hadn't been outside, if his dog hadn't been there. Small details like that are sometimes the only thing standing between a child and something irreversible. I also think about how easily this could have been dismissed if I hadn't found help immediately. How often kids try to explain something scary and aren't believed. How often predators rely on that disbelief. Even now, years later, my body reacts when I remember that moment. My chest tightens, my heart speeds up. Sleep isn't always peaceful. Trauma doesn't need physical harm to be real. The fear alone is enough to change you. What makes me angriest is how preventable it all was. Brent should never have been there. Bree should never have suggested that game. My friend's mother should never have allowed people like that around children. Every layer of protection failed us that day, except for one adult who took a crying child seriously. I don't believe in pretending these things didn't happen to keep people comfortable. What happened was real. It was terrifying. And it left marks that didn't fade just because time passed. I don't know where Brent or Bree are now. I don't know what happened to my friend's mother. I don't know how many other children were hurt before or after that day. What I do know is that I survived something that could have ended very differently. And I know this for sure. Children know when something is wrong. That feeling I had wasn't imagination. It wasn't drama. It was my instincts doing their job. And I wish more adults trusted that instinct instead of dismissing it. All I wanted was to watch a cartoon finale with my friend. Instead, I learned how dangerous adults can be when they choose to be. That lesson never really leaves you. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. I was part of an overseas camp when I was younger. One of those programs meant to be educational, cultural, and exciting all at once. There were around 40 to 60 kids there, all roughly around the same age, all from different places, all thrown together into this unfamiliar environment. We were staying in Inner Mongolia, which already felt surreal to me. It was wide, open, and unlike anywhere I had ever been before. The land stretched out endlessly, the air felt different, and everything about the place made it feel far removed from normal life. At first, the camp felt like an adventure. The days were filled with activities meant to keep us busy, entertained, and learning. We were constantly being moved from one place to another, one experience to the next. There wasn't much time to stop and think. You just followed instructions, trusted the adults, and did what you were told. That trust felt natural at the time. After all, we were kids, and these were the adults responsible for our safety. One day, we were taken to an archery activity. It sounded exciting. Most of us had never tried archery before, and the idea of shooting arrows at targets in such a remote and open place felt kind of cool. The setup looked simple enough. Targets were placed far away, and we were lined up with bows and arrows. The adults explained the basic rules, showed us how to hold the bow, how to aim, and where to stand. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. Kids took turns shooting arrows. Some arrows hit the targets, most missed, and everyone laughed about it. There was a light, relaxed feeling in the air. No one seemed tense. No one seemed worried. It felt like just another camp activity, something we would talk about later as a fun memory. About 5 minutes in, everything changed. The shift was sudden and jarring. One moment there was laughter and casual noise. The next moment, there was screaming. Not playful screaming, not excitement. Real screaming. The kind that makes your stomach drop before you even understand what's happening. At first, I didn't know where it was coming from. My brain struggled to process the sound. It didn't make sense in the context of what we were doing. But then people started reacting. Adults shouted. Kids froze. Some kids started crying immediately, even before they fully understood why. It turned out that the adults had failed to supervise properly. While some kids were shooting arrows, other kids were nearby without anyone closely watching them. There was no clear system in place to separate shooters from bystanders. No strict control. No one paying enough attention to what could go wrong. And something did go wrong. A child had been shot in the forehead. I remember the moment when I saw him. It's burned into my memory in a way that hasn't faded, even years later. There was blood. A lot of it. More than I had ever seen in real life before. It didn't look like something from a movie. It looked raw, chaotic, and terrifying. Adults immediately started moving everyone else away. We were told to go back inside. Voices were loud and urgent. There was panic in the air, even though the adults were trying to stay controlled. Kids were ushered away quickly, some of us looking back, others too scared to turn around. I didn't fully understand the details in that moment, but later we found out what had happened. An arrow had hit the child in the forehead. Somehow, against all odds, he was wearing sunglasses at the time. That small detail may have saved his life. If the arrow had been just a little lower, or at a slightly different angle, it could have gone straight through his eye. The outcome could have been far worse. Even knowing that now, the image still makes my chest feel tight. The idea that something so simple, something meant to be safe and supervised, came that close to ending a child's life is horrifying. We were taken back inside and told to stay there. No one explained much. We were confused, scared, and whispering among ourselves. Some kids were crying openly. Others sat quietly, clearly in shock. But I remember feeling a strange mix of fear and disbelief. It didn't feel real. It felt like something that shouldn't have happened, something that belonged outside of the safe bubble adults always promise kids. Eventually, an ambulance arrived. This part still feels surreal when I think about it. We were in the middle of nowhere. Inner Mongolia is vast and remote, and the idea that emergency services could even reach us felt unreal at the time. But they did. The child was taken away, and later we learned that he received stitches. Physically, he survived. That's the part everyone focuses on when they hear this story. And yes, it's important. It could have been so much worse. But that doesn't erase what happened, or how close it came to being catastrophic. That should have been the end of it. Or at least, that should have been the moment when parents were informed. Accountability was taken, and changes were made. But that's not what happened. That night, we were all told something that didn't sit right with me, even back then. We were told not to tell our parents about the incident. No calls home explaining what happened. No official reports that we were aware of. Just a quiet, collective instruction to keep it to ourselves. At the time, I didn't fully grasp how wrong that was. I was young. I trusted authority. When adults tell you something firmly, you tend to accept it. But there was still a strange feeling in my gut, a sense that this was being hidden, not handled. Life at the camp went on after that, as if nothing had happened. Activities continued. Schedules stayed the same. The archery incident was never openly discussed again. It became something whispered about between kids, something that felt almost unreal, like a shared nightmare everyone pretended not to remember. When I eventually went home, my parents asked the usual questions. Did you have fun? What did you learn? What was your favorite activity? I answered honestly about most things. I talked about the place, the culture, the food, the experiences. But I didn't tell them about the arrow. I didn't tell them about the blood. I didn't tell them how close someone came to losing their eye, or worse. And the strange thing is, I kept that secret. Years passed. 1 year, 2 years, more. And my parents still don't know. Even now, thinking about it feels strange. It's not a secret I actively think about all the time, but when I do remember it, it hits me how serious it actually was. As I got older, I started to understand the situation differently. I realized how irresponsible the adults had been, how dangerous it was to allow children to use archery equipment without strict supervision, how unacceptable it was to tell kids to hide something like that from their parents. That wasn't a small scrape or a minor accident. That was a life-threatening injury. I also started to understand how deeply an experience like that can affect people, even if they don't talk about it openly. Seeing that much blood, hearing that kind of screaming, being so far from home in a foreign place, trusting adults completely, and watching that trust crack. Those things don't just disappear. What stays with me most is how quiet everything became afterward. No accountability that we saw. No acknowledgement. Just silence. That silence felt heavier than the screaming in some ways. It was like the entire incident was buried, even though it should have been confronted. I sometimes wonder about the child who was injured. I wonder how he remembers it. I wonder if his parents ever found out. I wonder if he carries the memory the same way I do, tucked away but still sharp when it resurfaces. I wonder if it changed how he sees authority, safety, or trust. Looking back now as an adult, the situation feels even more disturbing. The fact that we were told not to tell our parents shows that the people in charge knew they had messed up. Instead of owning it, they chose secrecy, and kids were the ones who carried that burden. It's strange how something that lasted only a few moments can stretch across years in your memory. How a single scream can echo long after it's over. That archery activity was supposed to be a harmless, even fun experience. Instead, it became a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when responsibility is neglected. Even now, my parents still don't know about it. Part of me feels like I should tell them. Another part feels like it's been so long that it almost belongs to the past, locked in its own place in time. But no matter what, the memory hasn't faded. It taught me something I didn't expect to learn at such a young age. It taught me that adults don't always protect you the way they're supposed to, that systems meant to keep people safe can fail, and that sometimes the most dangerous part isn't the accident itself, but the way it's quietly covered up afterward. That day in Inner Mongolia didn't just end with stitches and an ambulance ride. It stayed with all of us, whether we talk about it or not. And even now, years later, it still feels unsettling to think about how close we came to something far worse, and how easily it was all brushed aside. When I was in grade school, there was a kid in my class who later told a story that stuck with me far more than most things from that age. At the time, we were probably in 5th grade, still young enough that the world felt mostly safe, but old enough to understand fear when it showed up. This was someone I had known for years, not a dramatic kid, not someone who constantly made things up for attention. They were actually known for being pretty straightforward, which is part of why the story never completely left my mind. One day, their parents were gone, and they were home alone. That alone wasn't unusual. Back then, plenty of kids stayed home for short periods without adults, especially if there were siblings or friends around. From what I remember, they weren't completely alone. There were other kids with them in the house, which made it feel safer at first. It was just a normal day. Nothing felt strange or threatening when it started. At some point, though, something changed. One of them noticed a man outside the house, close enough to peer through a window. Not walking by, not standing at a distance. He was right there, looking in. That alone would have been terrifying for kids that age, but what made it so much worse was that he was holding a knife. Not hidden, not subtle, just clutching it while staring into the house. When they told the story later, they said the moment froze them. There was no screaming right away, no immediate reaction. Just that split second where your brain tries to understand what it's seeing and fails. A grown man, a knife, looking directly at you through a window while you're inside what's supposed to be a safe place. Panic set in fast after that. They didn't try to confront him. They didn't go outside. Instinct took over. They ran upstairs as quietly and as fast as they could, hearts racing, not knowing if he could hear them or see them moving. They locked themselves in a closet, the kind of space that suddenly feels way too small when fear kicks in. They had a phone with them, which was probably the only thing keeping them grounded. From inside that dark, cramped space, they called their parents. I don't remember if they called the police too, or if that happened later. But I do remember that their parents came home as quickly as they could. By the time adults arrived, the man was gone. There was no dramatic confrontation. No moment where the threat was clearly resolved. Just the lingering fear and confusion. The house looked the same as it always had. The windows were intact. Nothing was obviously damaged. But the feeling of safety was gone. At that age, it's hard to process something like that. Kids don't always have the words for it. You feel shaken, but you also feel unsure whether you're allowed to be shaken. Was it really as bad as it felt? Did it really happen the way you remember it? When adults start talking calmly again, it can almost make you doubt your own fear. Then, a day or two later, something else came out. They found out that just a block or two away, there had been a murder. I don't remember all the details of that part. I don't know who the victim was or how it happened. I don't know if it made the news widely or stayed more local. What mattered was the proximity. It wasn't across town. It wasn't somewhere distant and abstract. It was right there, close enough that you could imagine the same person walking those streets. Suddenly, the man at the window didn't feel like a random creep anymore. He felt connected to something much darker. For a 5th grader, that kind of realization is heavy. It's the moment where you start to understand that bad things don't only happen far away or to other people. They can happen right next door. They can brush up against your life without warning. Even when they told the story later, there was uncertainty in their voice. Not because they were lying, but because time had passed. Memories blur, especially childhood ones. They would say things like, "I think," or "I'm pretty sure," when talking about certain details. But the core of the story never changed. A man, a knife, a window, fear, hiding. That's part of why it stuck with me. Could it have been exaggerated? Possibly. Kids sometimes misunderstand situations. Sometimes fear fills in gaps that reality doesn't. That's always a possibility with stories from that age. But this wasn't someone who regularly made things up. They weren't known for bluffing or telling wild tales just to get attention. If anything, they were usually pretty reserved. That made it harder to dismiss. As I got older, I thought about that story differently. I started to realize how close they might have come to something truly awful. If that man had decided to try a door instead of a window, if they hadn't noticed him in time, if they hadn't had a phone, if their parents hadn't come home quickly, small details like that suddenly feel enormous when you replay them. It also made me think about how fragile safety really is, especially for kids. We grow up assuming that home is a protected space, that walls and locks are enough. But moments like that show how easily that sense of protection can crack. What unsettled me most wasn't even the possibility that the man was connected to the nearby murder, though that part is terrifying. It was the randomness of it all. There was no warning, no pattern. Just a normal day that turned into something unforgettable because one person made a choice to stand at a window with a knife. Even now, years later, I still think about how that must have felt for them in that closet. The quiet, the waiting, the fear that every sound might mean he was inside. That kind of fear doesn't just disappear. It settles somewhere deep and stays there, even if you don't talk about it. I also think about how stories like that often fade into the background of our memories. We remember them as strange anecdotes, something creepy that happened a long time ago. But at the time, they shape how kids see the world. They plant the idea that danger isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it just shows up at your window. Whether the story was exactly as it happened or slightly distorted by time, the fear behind it was real. And the fact that a murder happened so close afterward only adds weight to that fear, even years later. It's one of those stories that never got a clear ending. No arrest that tied everything together. No explanation that made it feel resolved. Just a lingering sense of what if hanging in the air. And maybe that's why it stays with me. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones with clear villains and neat conclusions. They're the ones that brush past your childhood, leave a mark, and then disappear, taking their answers with them. There was a man named Charlie Bryant who murdered his wife in the town where I live, and the reason the case still gets talked about is because so much of it was caught on their own security cameras. It's one of those stories that people struggle to wrap their heads around, not just because of the violence, but because of how ordinary everything looked right up until it happened. It wasn't some dark alley or remote place. It was a home, a family, a driveway, the kind of setting people assume is safe. From what I remember and what people later learned, things had been tense in their marriage. There had been arguments, and that day was no different. His wife was getting ready to take their daughter and leave, at least for the moment, to cool off and get away from the argument they were having. It wasn't some dramatic escape plan. It was a parent trying to remove a child from a volatile situation, something many people would see as the responsible thing to do. There were rumors afterward that Charlie had been taking steroids at the time. I don't know how much of that was officially confirmed and how much came from people trying to explain what felt unexplainable. When something this violent happens, everyone looks for a reason, something concrete. Something that can turn a human being into a warning label instead of a person. Steroids, rage, stress, jealousy. People want a cause because the alternative is harder to accept. What is known is that his wife never made it to the car. As she was outside before she could leave, He came up behind her and shot her in the head. There was no struggle caught on camera, no long confrontation, just sudden violence. I'm the kind that gives no chance to react, no time to run, no opportunity for anyone to intervene. One moment she was alive, trying to protect her child, and the next moment she was gone. After he shot her, he shot himself in the arm. The intention, from what investigators later determined, was to make it look like self-defense, like there had been a fight, like he had been attacked and had no choice. It was a calculated move, not something done in panic or confusion. That part is what unsettles people the most when they hear about it. It wasn't just violence. It was violence followed by an attempt to rewrite the story. Under normal circumstances, that might have been harder to immediately disprove. But this case had a detail that changed everything. The house wasn't technically in Charlie's name. It was in his father-in-law's name. And because of that, the father-in-law had access to the home's security system. He received notifications about changes to the cameras. When the cameras were turned off around the time of the incident, it triggered an alert. That detail alone feels almost unreal, like something written into a script rather than real life. When the father-in-law noticed the cameras had been turned off, he didn't ignore it. He turned them back on remotely. And because of that, the events were recorded. Not guesses, not interpretations, actual footage showing what happened. Everything Charlie had tried to control unraveled because of that decision. The cameras captured the truth. They showed that his wife was not attacking him. They showed that she was trying to leave. They showed that he came up behind her. They showed the order of events. They showed that the injury to his arm happened after he shot her, not before. There was no room left for self-defense as an argument, no ambiguity, no gray area. When people in town found out, the reaction was a mix of shock, anger, and deep sadness. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't someone people expected to hear about on the news. This was someone who lived where we live, whose family existed alongside other families, whose driveway looked like any other driveway. What makes cases like this linger is how ordinary they feel until the moment they aren't. There was no obvious monster hiding in plain sight, at least not one people recognized. Just a man, a woman, a child, and an argument that escalated into something irreversible. The presence of the child in this story is what makes it especially heavy. This wasn't just a murder. It was the destruction of a family in front of someone too young to understand it. A child whose life was permanently altered in a matter of seconds. No matter what happens legally afterward, that damage can't be undone. The footage itself became central to the case. It removed doubt. It removed the ability to manipulate the narrative. It showed intent. And in doing so, it turned what might have been a complicated legal battle into something painfully clear. People still talk about the irony of it, how the attempt to hide the truth directly led to it being exposed, how technology, which was likely meant to provide security and peace of mind, became the reason justice could not be avoided. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that violence like this can unfold so quickly in such a familiar space. It forces people to confront the reality that danger doesn't always look dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it looks like a couple arguing in a driveway. Sometimes it looks like a parent trying to take their child away from a conflict. It also raises uncomfortable questions about control, about what happens when someone feels like they're losing it, losing their family, losing authority, losing the version of life they believe they deserve. In moments like that, some people don't retreat. They lash out in the most final way possible. Even now, thinking about it leaves a heavy feeling, not just because of the violence itself, but because of how preventable it feels in hindsight. If the argument had ended differently, if someone had stepped in earlier, if the child had been somewhere else, those thoughts don't change anything, but they linger anyway. Cases like this tend to become reference points in a community. People say things like, "Remember when that happened," or "That was the case with the cameras." It becomes shorthand for a kind of fear that doesn't fully go away. A reminder that domestic violence doesn't always announce itself clearly, and that the most dangerous moments often happen when someone is trying to leave. What stays with me the most is the idea that the truth was almost lost. If the cameras hadn't been turned back on, the story might have looked very different at first. There might have been confusion, doubt, delays. Instead, there was evidence that spoke for the woman who could no longer speak for herself. That doesn't make the story easier, but it does matter. It matters because it reminds people why accountability matters, why believing victims matters, why systems that record and document can sometimes be the only voice left when someone is silenced. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lesson written in the worst possible way, a reminder that violence inside the home is real, that control can turn deadly, and that sometimes the smallest technical detail can mean the difference between truth being buried and truth being seen. And even though time passes, stories like this don't fully fade. They sit in the background of a place. They change how people think about arguments they hear next door, about someone trying to leave with their child, about how quickly everything can go wrong. That's what makes it stick. Not just the crime itself, but the way it forces everyone who hears about it to confront how fragile safety really is, even in places that are supposed to feel like home. The small town I grew up in was the kind of place people like to describe as quiet and safe. Everyone knew everyone, or at least felt like they did. Violent crime was rare enough that when something bad happened, it stayed in people's memories for years. It wasn't the kind of town where you locked your doors out of fear, or where police sirens were part of everyday noise. Most trouble came in small, ordinary forms. Arguments, petty theft, things people shook their heads at and moved on from. Because of that, anything truly violent stood out sharply. It didn't blend into the background. It became part of the town's shared memory, something people whispered about or referenced vaguely without wanting to go into too much detail. And there was one place in particular that everyone seemed to know about, even if no one liked talking about it directly. It was just a house. Nothing special to look at least at first. It wasn't massive or ornate or obviously different from the others around it. It sat on an ordinary street surrounded by other homes where families lived normal lives. Kids rode bikes past it. People walked their dogs nearby. On the surface, there was nothing about it that screamed danger. But over time, people started to notice a pattern. People kept dying there. Not all at once. Not in a way that immediately made headlines. It happened slowly, stretched out over years. Roughly 18 years, give or take. Different owners, different renters, different circumstances. But the same address kept coming up again and again. Murders, violent deaths, situations that went far beyond accidents or bad luck. At first, people tried to rationalize it. Coincidence, bad tenants, just unfortunate timing. After all, it didn't make sense that one house could be connected to so much violence in a town where almost nothing violent ever happened. But as the years went on and the list grew longer, it became harder to ignore. The house changed hands multiple times. Each time, someone new came in believing it would be different for them. Maybe they didn't know the history, or maybe they knew and told themselves it was exaggerated. People do that when they want a good deal or a fresh start. They convince themselves that the past doesn't matter, that walls don't remember. But things never seem to settle there. Murders happen under different owners, under different circumstances, but the result was always the same. Someone ended up dead. Police came, and neighbors watched from behind curtains. The street would go quiet for a while afterward, like the whole area was holding its breath. Then life would resume, but the house would sit there, heavier than before. Eventually, it became harder and harder to keep people living there. Renters moved out quickly. Owners sold the place as soon as they could. Sometimes it sat empty for stretches of time, windows dark, yard unkempt, slowly slipping out of sync with the rest of the neighborhood. The longer it stood without anyone inside, the more it seemed to decay, not just physically, but in reputation. People avoided it without really talking about why. Kids dared each other to walk past it at night. Parents warned their children to stay away without offering much explanation. It became one of those places everyone knew about but didn't want to claim any real knowledge of. Just a bad house, a wrong place. Over time, the neglect showed. Paint peeled, the yard grew wild, windows broke and weren't replaced. The house looked tired, like it had been worn down by everything that had happened inside it. Even in daylight, it didn't feel welcoming. At night, it felt worse. Eventually, it landed in the hands of what would be the final owner. By then, the house was more trouble than it was worth. No one wanted to live there. No one wanted to buy it unless the price was low enough to justify the risk. Repairs piled up. Insurance costs climbed. And the history followed it, no matter how many times the deed changed hands. At some point, the owner decided it wasn't worth trying anymore. Rather than keep pouring money into a property that couldn't be rented or sold easily, he made a different decision. He chose to burn it down and collect the insurance money, to cut his losses and be done with it, to erase the problem entirely. On paper, maybe it looked like a clean ending. The house was already a lost cause. No one wanted it. No one trusted it. Destroying it would remove a stain from the neighborhood and let everyone move on. But a house like that wasn't going to disappear quietly. Before it could be demolished or officially dealt with, a homeless man had broken in. With the house empty and abandoned, it offered shelter from the elements. A place to sleep. A place to hide. In towns like that, abandoned buildings often attract people who have nowhere else to go. It wasn't surprising, even if it was tragic. When the fire was set, he was still inside. Whether the owner knew someone was squatting there or not became part of the story people argued about afterward. Some believed he had no idea. Others believed he didn't care enough to check. Either way, the result was the same. The fire spread quickly through the old structure, dry and weakened by years of neglect. The homeless man never made it out. In the end, the house claimed one last life. That detail is what cemented the place in people's minds forever. It wasn't enough that the house had already been linked to multiple murders over nearly 2 decades. It had to end with another death, one that felt especially cruel because it came from greed and indifference rather than rage or personal conflict. When the fire was finally out, there was nothing left worth saving. Just ash, debris, and the remains of a building that had caused more pain than most people could understand. The lot was cleared, and eventually the space where the house once stood became empty. And it stayed that way. For over a decade now, that spot has been nothing but an empty lot. Grass grows there, weeds come and go, snow covers it in winter, sun bakes it in summer, life moves around it, but nothing takes root on it. No new house, no playground, no memorial, just space. People still know what it is, though, or what it was. Even new residents, people who moved to town long after the house burned down, tend to hear about it eventually. Stories have a way of sticking around in the small towns. They get passed down casually, mentioned in conversation, referenced with a glance or a nod. That's where the house used to be. You don't even have to finish the sentence. There's something unsettling about an empty lot that stays empty for that long. In a town where space is valuable and development is slow but steady, an unused piece of land stands out. It's like the town collectively decided that whatever happened, there was enough, that nothing else needed to be built on top of it. Some people say it's just practical. Others quietly admit it feels wrong to put anything there, as if the ground itself carries memory, as if building over it would be inviting something back. Looking back, the house feels almost unreal, like something out of a story rather than something that existed in a real place with real people. But it was real. The deaths were real, the fire was real, and the man who died inside during that final act of destruction was real too. What makes it unsettling isn't just the violence, it's the repetition. The way the same address kept resurfacing in police reports and conversations. The way it slowly drained itself of life until it stood empty, waiting for its last chapter. In a town that rarely saw violence, that house became an exception that proved how fragile the idea of safety can be. How even in quiet places, darkness can gather in one spot and linger far longer than anyone expects. Even now, when people walk past that empty lot, there's often a subtle shift in behavior. Conversations trail off, steps quicken slightly, eyes move forward instead of lingering. No one likes to stand there for too long, even though there's nothing visibly wrong with it anymore. The house is gone. The walls are gone. The roof is gone. But the story isn't. It's still there, woven into the place where the building once stood. A reminder that some locations carry histories that don't disappear when the structure does, and that sometimes the most unsettling landmarks aren't the ones that still stand, but the ones that were erased after causing too much damage to ignore. That empty lot has been there for a decade now, silent and unclaimed, like a pause the town never quite resolved. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some places don't need to be filled again. Maybe leaving them empty is the closest thing to peace they'll ever have. From grade 4 through grade 6, I went to the same school district. And because of that, it was mostly the same group of students year after year. There weren't many new faces coming in, and there weren't many people leaving either. It was the kind of environment where you might not be close friends with everyone, but you still recognized almost all the faces. You knew names, personalities, habits. You had shared classrooms, recesses, assemblies, and awkward group activities long enough that everyone felt familiar in some way. There was one kid in particular I remember from that time. I don't remember his name clearly anymore, but I remember his face. I remember his glasses first, because they always stood out to me. They were a little too big for his face, the kind that slipped down his nose. I remember him being really shy, not quiet in a way that felt cold or distant, but quiet in a way that felt gentle. He didn't push himself into conversations. He didn't try to be the center of attention. He was just there, observant, calm, and noticeably smart. Everyone kind of knew he was smart, even if they didn't say it out loud. Teachers treated him with a certain respect. Other kids would sometimes go to him for help, especially with schoolwork. He wasn't the kind of kid who showed off or made people feel bad for not knowing something. He just helped, simply and patiently. I remember one specific moment when I asked him for help with something. I don't remember exactly what the assignment was, but I remember the feeling of sitting next to him and watching how easily he understood it. He explained it in a way that made sense without making me feel stupid. That small interaction stuck with me more than I realized at the time. Later, there was some kind of sport or activity we did every year. I honestly don't remember what it was called. It might have been a field day or some kind of organized event where everyone had to participate in teams. It wasn't really about competition as much as it was about teamwork and trying different things. I remember that during this event, I ended up helping him out. Maybe he wasn't confident physically, or maybe he just needed encouragement. Whatever it was, I remember being there for him the way he had been there for me earlier. We weren't best friends. We didn't hang out outside of school. We didn't sit together every day or share secrets. But there was a quiet familiarity between us, and the kind that comes from being in the same place for a long time and having small moments of kindness passed back and forth. Then, in the middle of 6th grade, my life changed. My family moved about an hour away. It wasn't a dramatic move, but it was enough to pull me out of that school district completely. Suddenly, all those familiar faces were gone. I had to start over somewhere new with new teachers, new classmates, and a different routine. Like most kids, I adjusted. Middle school brings enough changes on its own that adding a move just becomes part of the chaos. I didn't think much about my old classmates after that. Not because they didn't matter, but because life moved on. New friends, new challenges, new distractions. Memories from elementary school started to feel distant, like something from another chapter of life. Then, in 7th grade, something happened that pulled one of those memories sharply back into focus. I remember my mom coming up to me one day. There was something different in her expression. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. She was serious in a quiet, careful way. She had her phone, or maybe a printed photo, and she showed it to me. She asked me if I knew the kid in the picture. I looked at it for a moment, and then I recognized him. The glasses, the face. It was him, the shy, smart kid from my old school. I told her yes, that I knew him, that we went to school together. Then she told me what had happened. Apparently one day, his mom picked him up from school like any other day. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. Parents picked up their kids all the time. Teachers didn't see anything wrong. No alarms were raised. It was just a normal pickup. But after that, she killed him. And then she killed herself. I don't remember all the details. I don't know if they were ever fully explained. And honestly, I don't think my mom wanted to go into specifics. Some things don't need details to be horrifying. I remember the feeling more than anything else. It felt unreal, like my brain refused to accept it at first. This wasn't a story from the news about strangers in another state. This was someone I had known, someone I had sat next to, someone I had talked to. Even though I didn't know him deeply, the connection was enough to make it hit hard. I remember thinking about how normal he had seemed, how quiet, how gentle, how nothing about him suggested that his life would end in such a violent, tragic way. And I thought about his mom, too, even though I had never met her. I wondered what could have happened inside her mind to lead to something like that. What kind of pain or illness could drive a parent to destroy their own child and themselves? At that age, I didn't have the tools to fully understand it. I just knew it was wrong and deeply sad. What made it stranger was the distance. I wasn't there anymore. I didn't hear it from classmates or teachers. I heard it secondhand in my new life, away from the place where it happened. It felt like the past had reached forward and touched me when I least expected it. I remember feeling guilty for a moment, even though I didn't know why. Guilty for having moved away. Guilty for being safe. Guilty for continuing on with my life when his had ended so abruptly. That kind of guilt doesn't make logical sense, but it still shows up. Wow, especially in kids. After that day, I didn't talk about it much. It wasn't something I brought up with friends. It felt too heavy, too personal. It became one of those quiet things you carry inside without knowing what to do with it. As time passed, the sharpness of the shock faded, but the memory didn't disappear. Every now and then, something would remind me of him. A kid with similar glasses. Someone quiet in a classroom. A moment where someone helps without expecting anything in return. I still think about him sometimes. Not in a dramatic way. Not constantly. Just in brief, quiet moments where his face pops into my mind. And I wonder what his life could have been like. What kind of person he would have grown into. What he might have done with that intelligence and kindness. Now, it's strange how someone you didn't know very well can still leave a mark on you. I think it's because he represents something bigger than just one person. He represents how fragile life can be, how quickly things can change, how tragedy doesn't care how smart, shy, or gentle someone is. He also represents one of the first times I truly understood that parents are not always safe, even though they're supposed to be. That adults can be deeply broken in ways kids can't protect themselves from. That the world isn't always predictable or fair. As an adult, looking back on it now, I understand more than I did then. I understand mental illness more. I understand how untreated conditions, stress, isolation, and despair can spiral into something catastrophic. But understanding doesn't make it easier. It doesn't make it okay. What stays with me the most is how ordinary everything was before it happened. A school pickup, a routine day. No warning signs that anyone else could see. Just a normal moment that turned into the end of a life. Sometimes I wonder how many people remember him now. How many people still carry his memory in small, quiet ways like I do. People who sat near him, people who borrowed a pencil, people who asked him for help once and never forgot how kind he was. He didn't get a long story. He didn't get to grow up and become someone adults talk about with full sentences and detailed memories. But he mattered. And even though our connection was small, it was real. That's why I still think about him. Not with fear, not with obsession, just with a quiet sense of sadness and respect. A reminder that even brief connections can leave lasting impressions, and that some lives, no matter how short, still deserve to be remembered. And in that way, he hasn't completely disappeared. He still exists in the memories of people who knew him, even if only for a short time. And sometimes that's all that's left, but it still counts. My mom had a best friend who went through something so tragic that it left a permanent mark on everyone around her. Back in 1992, she had a baby boy named John. He was only 8 months old when he died suddenly from cot death. One day he was alive, and the next he was gone. There was no warning, no illness that anyone could point to, no chance to prepare, just a baby who didn't wake up. At that time, sudden infant death wasn't as openly discussed as it is now. There weren't as many explanations, support groups, or resources for parents going through it. People didn't know how to talk about it, and many didn't know how to support someone living through that kind of loss. It was often treated as something unspeakable, something to be quietly endured rather than openly processed. John's death devastated his mother completely. That kind of loss doesn't just hurt, it shatters something deep inside you. Losing a child isn't like losing anything else. It goes against the natural order people expect from life. Parents aren't supposed to outlive their children. When that happens, especially so suddenly, it can fracture a person's sense of reality. My mom stayed close to her during that time. She tried to be there, to help where she could, to offer comfort even when there were no words that could fix anything. But grief like that doesn't have a timeline. It doesn't wrap itself up neatly. It changes you, often permanently. 2 years later, John's mother had another baby. This time, it was a boy named Andrew. From the outside, people probably hoped that Andrew's birth would bring some healing, that it would restore some joy, some balance, some sense of normalcy. Sometimes people assume that a new baby can fill the space left by the one who died. But that space can't really be filled. It can only be carried alongside something new. Andrew grew up in a household shaped by grief, whether people spoke about it openly or not. Even when parents don't talk about loss, children can feel it. It lives in the quiet moments, in the tension, in the way adults react to certain things. It becomes part of the emotional environment without needing to be explained. When Andrew was about 3 years old, something happened that changed everything again. He started talking to himself. At first, it didn't seem especially unusual. Young children often talk out loud while they play. They narrate what they're doing. They invent stories. They create imaginary friends. Most parents don't think much of it. It's considered a normal stage of development. Andrew's mother noticed that he seemed to be playing with someone who wasn't there. He talked as if another child was present, responding to questions, laughing, interacting. Eventually, she asked him about it. She asked who he was talking to, expecting a made-up name or a simple explanation. Andrew told her that his friend's name was John. Then he said something that stopped her cold. He said John was his brother. This wasn't a name she had mentioned to him. It wasn't something his father had spoken about either. As far as anyone knew, Andrew had never been told about the baby who died before he was born. The name John had been deliberately avoided. It was too painful, too loaded, too tied to grief that had never fully healed. Hearing that name come from her 3-year-old son broke something inside her. It wasn't just the coincidence of the name. It was the way he said it, with certainty, with simplicity, not as a game or a story, but as a statement of fact. To her, it felt impossible, like something that shouldn't have been able to happen, whether it was coincidence, subconscious cues, or something else entirely. It didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was how deeply it affected her. Her mental health, which had already been fragile since John's death, collapsed completely. She couldn't cope with it. The idea that her living child was talking about the one she had lost, especially without being told, overwhelmed her. It reopened wounds that had never properly closed. It made her question reality. It brought back grief with a force she couldn't contain. She became unwell enough that she was eventually committed. Her husband took custody of Andrew during that time. He became the stable parent, the one who could provide consistency while she was unable to care for herself. My mom tried to help pick up the pieces as much as she could. She stayed involved, offered support, helped where she was allowed to help. She cared deeply about her friend and about Andrew. She wanted to believe things could get better, that healing was still possible. But my dad saw the situation differently. My dad was a police officer, and his way of seeing the world had been shaped by years of exposure to things most people never have to face. He believed strongly in boundaries, in distance, in protecting your own family from situations that felt unstable or unpredictable. He told my mom to stay away from that family. He said something wasn't right there. I don't think he meant anything supernatural by it. I got the impression that, to him, it was about mental health, about how being close to people in deep psychological distress could affect those around them, especially children. Back then, mental health wasn't talked about the way it is now. It was often misunderstood, feared, or treated as something contagious rather than something deserving compassion and support. My dad wasn't unkind, but he was cautious. To him, this wasn't a situation to get emotionally tangled in. He saw danger in instability, and he believed it was healthier to create distance rather than stay involved. That created tension. My mom felt torn between loyalty to her friend and the desire to protect her own family. Over time, eye contact became less frequent. Life moved forward in uneven, painful steps. As for Andrew, I don't know exactly how much he remembered as he got older. Children often forget early memories, or they reinterpret them in ways that feel safer. But the impact of those early years, of living in a home shaped by loss and instability, likely stayed with him in ways that aren't always visible. Eventually, his mother returned to the family. She wasn't gone forever. She came back and tried to rebuild her life, her marriage, and her relationship with her son. But things were never the same. By around 2001, the marriage ended in divorce. That outcome doesn't feel surprising when you look at everything that came before it. Losing a child can strain even the strongest relationships. Add mental illness, hospitalization, unresolved grief, and the weight of strange, unexplainable moments, and it becomes even harder. To this day, I still don't know what to make of what Andrew said when he was 3. Part of me believes it could have been coincidence. Children hear things they aren't supposed to. Names can slip out unintentionally. Grief can shape perception. The human brain is very good at finding meaning, especially when we're desperate for answers. Another part of me isn't so sure. There are moments in life that don't fit neatly into logic, and this feels like one of them. It sits in that uncomfortable space between chance and something more, and it never fully settles into either category. What I do know is that it had real consequences. Regardless of the explanation, it shattered a woman who had already lost more than anyone should have to lose. It changed the course of a family. It shaped a child's upbringing. It altered friendships and marriages and futures. It also highlights how fragile the human mind can be when grief is left unresolved, how easily trauma can resurface in unexpected ways, how something small, a few words spoken by a child, can reopen wounds so deep they feel unbearable. Looking back now with more understanding of mental health than the people had back then, I feel more compassion than confusion. I don't see a mystery that needs solving so much as a story about loss, pain, and the limits of what a person can endure. I also think about how different things might have been if there had been better support, better understanding, more open conversations about grief and trauma. Maybe the outcome would have been the same. Maybe it wouldn't. There's no way to know. What stays with me is the uncertainty. The not knowing whether Andrew's words were random or meaningful. The not knowing whether his mother ever found peace with it. The not knowing how much of that early chaos followed him into adulthood. Some stories don't offer closure. They just exist as questions we carry. And this is one of those stories. It stayed with me because it sits at the intersection of grief, mental health, and something that feels just beyond explanation. Not in a dramatic or sensational way, but in a quiet, unsettling way that resurfaces when you least expect it. In the end, maybe it doesn't matter why Andrew said what he said. What matters is that a family was already broken by loss, and that moment was enough to break it further. And that's something that doesn't need a supernatural explanation to be tragic. A few months ago, my dad told me a story that genuinely unsettled me. Not because it was dramatic or flashy, but because of how serious he and his sister were when they told it. They didn't laugh about it. They didn't hedge their words. They didn't say maybe or I think. They both swore, without hesitation, that what they remembered was true. They swore on their lives, which is something they almost never do. That alone made me listen differently. The story goes back to 1976. At the time, my dad was 8 years old. His sister was 12. Their parents were in their 40s. They were living in Staten Island, which is hard for a lot of people to imagine now as anything other than suburban or urban. But back then, parts of it were still rural. There were wooded areas, quiet roads, stretches of land that felt isolated once the sun went down. It wasn't the Staten Island people picture today. It was Christmas Eve. That detail matters to my grandparents. Even though they weren't religious, none of them were. They didn't go to church. They didn't talk about angels or signs or miracles. Christmas for them was more about family and routine than belief. That's part of what makes the story linger, because they weren't people who framed experiences through a spiritual lens. That night, the whole family got into the car and pulled out of their driveway. My dad doesn't remember exactly why they were leaving. It could have been to run errands, visit a relative, or do something last minute. It wasn't memorable in itself. It was just an ordinary decision on an ordinary evening. They followed the familiar road that led toward a boulevard. It was a route they knew well, one they had driven many times before. As they approached an intersection, everyone in the car was already aware of the place's reputation. That intersection had seen a lot of accidents over the years. Not one or two, but many. My dad later said it was estimated that around 15 car accidents had happened there in just a few years. It wasn't marked with anything dramatic, no memorials, no signs warning drivers. But people who lived nearby knew. It was a bad spot. Visibility wasn't great. Cars came through at awkward angles. Mistakes happened easily there. When they reached the intersection, my grandparents made a right turn and started heading down a hill. Everything still felt normal. Just a family in a car, all moving through a quiet area on a winter evening. Then they saw something strange. To their left, creeping up the hill, was a car that looked like it should not have been moving at all. The vehicle was badly damaged. Not scraped or dented, but mangled. The engine was pushed up so far that it blocked most of the windshield. That alone should have made the car undrivable. Because of that, the driver had his head stuck out of the side window, leaning outward so he could see where he was going. My dad described him as looking about 25 years old. Young, not elderly, not someone who looked confused or frail. The rest of the car looked just as wrong. The body was bent. The wheels wobbled as it moved. It didn't glide up the hill so much as struggle, like something held together just enough to keep rolling. My dad said, even as a kid, he was shocked the car could start, let alone climb a hill. Everyone in the car noticed it immediately. My grandparents were taken aback. This wasn't something you see and shrug off. It was disturbing in a practical way first. They were concerned. A car that damaged meant someone could be hurt. Someone might need help. They continued down the hill, watching the car in their mirrors. The image stuck with them instantly. The man's face, the way he leaned out the window, the unnatural shape of the vehicle. After a moment, my grandparents decided to turn around. They made a U-turn so they could go back up the hill and check on the man. That decision makes sense. They weren't reckless people, but they weren't indifferent either. If someone needed help, they wanted to offer it. As they drove back up the hill, they expected to see the car again. It couldn't have gone far. It was barely functional. There wasn't much road ahead of it. But when they reached the spot where they had just seen the man, there was nothing. No car, no man, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That's where the story shifts from strange to unsettling. It wasn't like the man could have simply driven away quickly. The car was too damaged for that. It wasn't like he could have turned into a nearby driveway. The nearest house with a garage was several blocks away. There was nowhere close he could have hidden the car. The only other place he could have gone was into the woods. But that didn't make sense either. Why would someone abandon a car in that condition and disappear into the trees? Especially on Christmas Eve. Especially after being seen. Especially when help might have been coming. They slowed down. They looked carefully. They didn't see tire tracks leading off the road. They didn't see headlights disappearing. There was nothing to explain where the man or the car had gone. The road was empty. That moment stuck with my grandparents deeply. They talked about it later, not as a joke, not as something fun or spooky, but as something that genuinely confused and unsettled them. They went over the details again and again, trying to figure out a logical explanation. They couldn't. The image of the man stayed with them, his face, his posture, the way he leaned out of the window, the way the car moved despite looking impossible to drive. Again, this is important to understand. They weren't religious people. They didn't believe in ghosts or signs or divine messages. They didn't frame the world in those terms. But even for them, the context made it harder to ignore. The intersection had a history of accidents, many of them, enough that it was known locally as a dangerous spot. And the date was Christmas Eve, a time that carries emotional weight even for people who don't practice religion. A time associated with reflection, endings, beginnings, and family. None of them said out loud what they were thinking. They didn't jump to conclusions. They didn't label it as anything supernatural. But the combination of the location, the condition of the car, the sudden disappearance, and the timing made them uneasy in a way they couldn't explain away. For my dad and his sister, the memory stayed vivid. Kids forget a lot of things from that age, but they didn't forget this. They both remember the same details, the same sequence of events, the same confusion afterward. As an adult, my dad still can't explain it. He doesn't try to embellish it. He doesn't claim to know what it was. He just says what he saw and what he didn't see afterward. What makes it more unsettling is that nothing else happened. There was no follow-up. No news story about a wrecked car being found nearby. No report of a missing driver. No explanation that surfaced later. It was just a moment that appeared and disappeared. When my grandparents got home that night, they talked about it quietly. They didn't scare the kids with speculation. They didn't turn it into a big story, but it stayed with them. It came up occasionally over the years, usually in low voices, usually with the same sense of unease. It wasn't fear exactly. It was confusion. The discomfort of seeing something that didn't fit into the rules they understood about how the world works. Hearing the story now, decades later, I find myself in the same position. I don't know what it was. I don't know if there's a rational explanation that was simply missed. Memory can be tricky, especially when time passes. But the consistency matters. My dad and his sister remember it the same way. My grandparents never changed their story, and none of them gained anything by telling it. There's no drama in it, no clear conclusion, just a strange encounter that left a mark. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are the ones that don't resolve, the ones that don't point clearly toward danger or comfort, the ones that sit in the middle, refusing to be explained. This is one of those stories. A damaged car climbing a hill when it shouldn't have been able to move. A man leaning out of a window driving something broken. An intersection known for accidents. A decision to turn around and help. And then nothing. No trace, no answer. Just a memory that stuck with people who weren't inclined to imagine things, who weren't looking for meaning beyond what they could see. And maybe that's why it still feels unsettling now. Because if people like that couldn't explain it and never stopped thinking about it, then maybe it really was something that didn't fit neatly into logic. Not necessarily something supernatural, just something unexplained. And sometimes those are the moments that stay with us the longest. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.